Hello, my name is Olivia Kinsman, and I firstly want to say a big thank you to the Pagan Federation for inviting me to speak during their 50th anniversary event. It's very exciting to have the privilege to speak on this historic occasion, so thank you, and thanks to all of you for tuning in to listen. Today I want to talk about my doctoral research, which contributes to the project of bridging the gap between goddess devotees, scholars, and heritage professionals. My experience entering into this research and discussion is informed through the lens of one with a background in Egyptology, working towards a career in heritage, and who also happens to be a practicing polytheist. As such, I'm one who exists hopping between the secular and the spiritual, depending on context, with an invested interest in both. Today my presentation will begin with a little information about me for context, followed by an introduction to my current doctoral research, defining goddess spirituality and looking at how modern goddess devotees bring ancient polytheism into the modern world. Throughout this, I will raise areas where my own insights as a polytheist intersect with questions I ask as a scholar studying pagan receptions of the ancient world. Finally, I will talk about the tensions that arise in this reception and how we might foster more mutually beneficial relationships moving forward. With my research, I hope to be a bridge between the two sides, which are actually not as oppositional as they are often portrayed to be. Not only do I wish to share my research with you, but I also want to prompt you to consider where modern pagans reside in the historical and religious narrative, which has proven to be an enlightening, reflexive practice for myself. So my academic background is in Egyptology. Egypt, ancient and modern, is my truest love. I'm interested in ancient Egyptian religion and especially Egyptian prehistory, as I love to explore the origins of what became ancient and modern Egypt. At present, though, I am a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Bristol under the primary supervision of the legendary Professor Ronald Hutton and supported by the exceptionally clever Professor Genevieve Lively. My research is looking at Anglo-American Goddess Spirituality, examining how it engages with history and archaeology to revive the veneration of ancient Mediterranean and Egyptian goddesses from a specifically 21st century Western feminist context. Goddess Spirituality, or GS, engages in a spectrum of historical revival and contemporary innovation, bringing aspects of ancient cults into the modern world with varying degrees of accuracy. My research is interdisciplinary, engaging with ancient sources as well as employing ethnographic methods to study the spiritual beliefs and practices of modern people. Whilst engaging in this research, it is important to point out that I also happen to be a polytheist who believes in the theistic reality of ancient and modern gods, goddesses, and spirits. I won't be going into too much detail about my personal beliefs, partly because they are personal, but also owing to the fact that there are many examples in academia where scholars have not engaged with contemporary pagans in an especially respectful or legitimizing manner. In fact, studies such as Paul Harrison's Profane Egyptologists have indicated that contemporary pagans within academia elect to keep their beliefs not merely private but actively hidden in fear of jeopardizing their careers. I, however, as someone with an online and televised pagan presence prior to my academic study, do not have the option to entirely withhold this aspect of my personal life from my colleagues. I will say that I do not personally identify with GS, but have done so in the past, and so possess many retrospective insider insights, and a lot of my own beliefs may overlap in some cases. Though I will not be discussing my personal practice today, I will be examining how my spiritual identity intersects with elements of my research, recognizing potential biases, privileges, and influences in keeping with scholarly best practice in reflexivity. It will be misleading and frankly inaccurate to suggest that my research is entirely unaffected by my personal beliefs. So in my research, I am interested in identifying what relevance goddess devotees find in ancient religions which are so far removed from their own time, geography and culture, and secondly, how they negotiate which aspects to historically revive, which ones to deviate from, and when to innovate. This is in contrast to traditions which have continued undisturbed since antiquity and who have therefore undergone changes organically over time. This situation is not unique to GS and can be seen across many, if not all, modern paganisms. However, I will keep referring to GS specifically as this is what my research centres on. As an insider, prior to this research, I already have my own ideas about why ancient Egyptian goddesses are relevant to one such as myself, living in the modern day in Wales. But through engaging in this research, situating myself in a secular mindset, I am learning social and historical influences that I was not overtly conscious of beforehand. So, imposed with the desire to worship a goddess or multiple goddesses or deities in a Western post Christian context, contemporary pagans have three options. They can create modern, new, synthetic goddesses. They can appropriate the goddesses of living traditions, which are typically from cultures other than their own. Or they can revive ancient goddesses from discontinued cultures, such as from ancient Egyptian or Greek polytheisms. All three methods are attestable in GS, and all three have invited criticism in some way. Whether it be denouncing goddesses as made up, practices as cultural appropriation, or revival as a kind of fantasy roleplay. At this point, I want to clarify what distinguishes GS from other forms of contemporary paganism. GS arose in the 1970s alongside second wave feminism and sought to challenge and create an alternative to androcentric monotheism. This history of GS is fascinating, contentious, and important. However, my research is explicitly about GS in the 21st century, so I cannot go into much detail about its origins here. In some instances, there is obvious continuation, especially when GS groups are run by or inspired by GS elders from like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In other instances, however, there are considerable changes taking place that reflect the arrival of the internet age and developing feminist discourses. GS was not the first approach to revive ancient goddesses, as well you might know, but it was unique in having an explicitly feminist edge to it. So my definition of GS reflects common trends in its 21st century manifestation. First, it is goddess-centered, so some devotees only revere goddesses, whereas others venerate gods and genderqueer deities alongside this, but venerating goddesses remains the primary focus. In the 20th century, GS stood out from other paganisms because it was categorically feminist. So this has always included various interpretations of feminism, which is even more obvious and contentious today. Not all goddess devotees are feminists, but in my research so far, the majority do appear to be. And this is probably because feminism is once again mainstream in its form. Feminism intersects with many other forms of activism as well, and GS supports this on a scale of individual empowerment as well as wider social justice. Essentially, GS commonly supports the idea that the personal is political and the spiritual is political. No, not every single group does. Like contemporary paganism more broadly, GS is inspired by ancient religious traditions, though it is more explicit in creating modern interpretations and is not a reconstructionist approach. In line with countercultural sentiments and activism, GS is non-dogmatic and self-led, prioritizing personal agency and gnosis. That said, some GS groups can be very structured, hierarchical, and capitalist, but this reflects the group rather than GS itself. GS also emphasizes sacred corporeality regarding the physical world, nature, people's bodies, and objects to possess sacred meaning or contain an essence of divinity. So you can see already lots of overlaps with other forms of contemporary paganism. Most of the time it is the goddess-centered and feminist angle that makes goddess spirituality what it is, but these other factors are really important as well. Each of these aspects link up and relate to one another, and it's not necessary for somebody to adhere to all five, but ideally they will at least identify with three, and goddess-centered ought to be amongst them. And there's no single agreed upon label for adherents of GS either. There are many different options that people use. I've opted to refer to them as goddess devotees at present, and don't seem to be having any contradiction with that. Rising in response to contemporary politics, GS has always been firmly planted in the present. It has never been reconstructionist in its approach to reviving ancient cults, and instead seeks to explore ways that ancient goddesses remain active and relevant in the present, in social and geographic contexts far removed from their origins and after over millennia of disrupted worship. This disruption means that the differences between ancient and modern cults appear radical, somewhat inorganic, and are implemented by devotees outside of the geographic locations of many goddesses' origins, without the ability for gradual mutual culture exchange. Goddess devotees recognize that goddess veneration today cannot and should not be identical to that of the past, and to do so would be to compromise its relevance. To recreate the ancient traditions accurately, such as of Greece and Rome, would be to revive and preserve sexist taboos and misogynies, which would be counterproductive for a feminist approach to spirituality. It would make little sense for modern Anglo-American feminists to maintain the ancient role of Artemis Diana as one who guides young girls into maturity in preparation for marrying older men, and who ensures that they fulfill their predestined civic duty and life's goal of giving birth to new Greek and Roman citizens. So obviously and reasonably, changes need to take place to repair this dissonance for the modern world. There are some who maintain the idea that the ancient and modern portrayals of certain goddesses in a negative, hypersexualized, or violent light is the result of patriarchal corruption, and who assert that further back in a supposed matriarchal prehistory, the goddesses were much more positive and empowering. So this idea is a hangover from the works of authors such as Bakoven, Jane Ellen Harrison, Maria Gimbutas, and others, intersecting with second-wave feminism. Many scholars today don't support these ideas, and not all goddess devotees hold to them either, but it's still quite common in GS literature and remains characteristic of GS overall. Something I'm emphasizing in my research is the fact that goddess devotees and secular scholars are adhering to different epistemological standpoints. When these two groups talk about ancient goddesses, they're not actually talking about the same thing. The current trend in scholarship is to employ academic atheism and accept the premise that polytheistic deities are confined and limited to texts, material objects, or one's imagination. Essentially, they are a thing. For goddess devotees, deities are represented by the things that secular scholars study, but they also exceed beyond these things as disembodied consciousness. For example, imagine that a scholar is talking about representations of a solar goddess in the historical or archaeological records, be it a carved relief, as on this slide here, a sculpture, or a written hymn. When a goddess devotee talks about a solar goddess of the same name, they are often talking about her inspired from their perceived experiences, such as from standing beneath the sun at midday, the sensation of the warmth on their skin, numinous feelings, or visualizations from guided meditations. So the scholars are talking about the representations, and according to the goddess devotees, they're talking about this disembodied thing external from it. When such accounts of this goddess differ, one side is often interpreted as misinformed. Perhaps they are both equally correct within the remit of their own conversations, of which they are engaged in two simultaneously. As articulated by Catherine Rowntree, they are speaking past each other. Scholars may therefore assert that Artemis Diana is not a feminist, as many goddess devotees claim her to be. Looking at the ancient sources representing Artemis, this is true, she would not be a feminist according to modern standards. But most of the time when goddess devotees talk about Artemis as a feminist, they specifically refer to her character today and not her character or interpretation of it in the past, except for those referring to a hypothetical prehistoric idea. These goddess devotees most of the time aren't really talking about the ancient sources. There's an idea in process theology that God, divinity, is affected by temporal processes, or in other words, divinity changes and adapts. Generally, secular ancient historians are not theologians, and so such theories are not part of their discipline. And to be honest, they're not part of mine either. This is very new ground for me. Interestingly, I have noticed that goddess devotees who also happen to be accredited scholars tend to be from fields relating to theology, philosophy, and women's studies. The Californian Institute of Integral Studies is a good example of this, of a legitimate academic institution that produces many of such scholars, whose postgraduate lectures on prehistoric religion promote ideas not accepted in other places. So even within academia, different epistemologies cause disagreement. So no wonder secular scholars of the ancient world and goddess devotees are often unable to resolve this fundamental difference, because they're talking about different things, even though they sound or think that they're talking about the same thing. This means that scholarly interpretations of pagan receptions of ancient religion remain preoccupied with historical accuracy rather than considering the mutability of religion. Ancient historians are concerned with the material and textual remains of deities and cults in the historical and archaeological records, and so appear frustrated about the modern reinterpretations that they consider to be, frankly, anachronistic, incorrect, and wrong. Ultimately, the past is not the present and the present is not the past, and these are two separate conversations that scholars and goddess devotees are having at the same time as each other. So let me tell you, the discourse gets very interesting when you are one sitting between the two camps. As a polytheist and scholar myself, I have to adopt two epistemological stances, but because they each fulfill different purposes, it isn't too difficult to keep them separate. The intellectual pursuit of studying the ancient world is to create a greater understanding of what life was like for ancient people. This requires science, accuracy, and objectivity, and for me to remove myself and my presentist views out of my interpretations as much as possible. I think most scholars today would agree that none of us can do this perfectly, but we can try to identify and mitigate biases nonetheless. It's a separate process entirely to then extract this information for spiritual purposes, selecting relevant details and adapting where necessary for modern use. The purpose of modern revival is not to necessarily learn how people lived in the past, though that is good contextual information to have. It is to learn how the ideas of the past are relevant to the present. This is why modern morals and ethics win out over accuracy in many instances. According to my thesis questionnaire so far, 95% of respondents were genuinely interested in the ancient world, in addition to their spiritual interests, with over half saying that they had this interest before they even discovered their spirituality. Though I'm still collecting responses, the majority of Aphrodite, Isis, and Sekhmet devotees who responded to my questionnaire have affirmed that researching a goddess's history was important and essential to their practice. What's more, such research, however basic or advanced, has become a form of devotional practice. The photo on this slide is of a beautiful book by historian Bettany Hughes, which has had an honoured place on the altars of many other Aphrodite Venus devotees. We often say that Asatru, Kemeticism, witchcraft, etc. are religions of homework. I'm not saying that all pagans do a lot of research, or necessarily any, but a lot of them do. Perhaps it is because they have not grown up inheriting these traditions and stories, so there's a lot of unlearning and re-education that needs to take place. I consider acknowledging the disrupted history of polytheistic worship in the Western world to be essential to understanding contemporary pagan processes. It is because of this that the differences between the ancient and the modern are often so vast, leading some scholars to be dismissive of them, saying that modern paganism is comparatively boring and without animal sacrifice, modern paganism has little or nothing to do with ancient paganisms. Many elements of Christianity infiltrate GS, even if quite unintentionally. This again has been used to criticize it. However, this is another consequence of reviving ancient goddesses in a post-Christian context. The same overlapping of traditions occurred at the dawn of Christianity, with churches repurposing pagan temples and icons. This is a part of the development of religion. I feel like the differences would be more sympathetically regarded if they happened organically over time, rather than the necessary result of recreating cults synthetically. When one takes the time to consider these differences properly, many actually seem very reasonable, such as refraining from animal sacrifice in light of how it's now illegal and viewed as unsanitary, or even unethical. I'd expect that if modern pagans were more historically accurate to the past and more exciting, they'd also garner criticism. So damned if you do and damned if you don't. I'm considering the modern reception of ancient goddesses in GS through three main interpretative themes. The first is theism and psychological models of spiritual engagement. As GS is an approach to spirituality, it does not prescribe one single way to conceptualize deity. As such, there are multiple theisms at work. A common assumption is that it supports monotheism, or a single great goddess. Whilst it does support this, because it supports all theistic methods, this may have been a more common idea pre-millennium. because only 7% of my questionnaire respondents identified with monotheism. Around 71% identified as polytheists instead, or at least held the pluralist notion of multiple coexisting truths. Some also combine this with a psychological model, viewing goddesses as archetypes and rituals as opportunities for self-actualization. Few are those who do this, though, without some form of theism as well. So more often it's the combination. So more often you'll have people who have a theistic belief as well as employing archetypal modes. And very rarely do you have people who just do it archetypally and don't believe in the reality of goddesses as well. As I previously said, this is the biggest conceptual difference between how goddess devotees engage with ancient history compared to scholars. The second theme is how goddess devotees prioritize how they view ancient goddesses according to their relevance in the present, and less so how they existed in the ancient world, though many remain interested in that as well. In antiquity, interpretatio Romana was a process that involved reinterpreting contemporary traditions from different cultures through a Roman lens. Based on this idea, I suggest that GS engages in interpretatio moderna, where it reinterprets ancient traditions through a modern lens, not just viewing the past through a presentist perspective, but actively reshaping ancient traditions. I call aspects and references to ancient traditions historical anchors, as they are the elements of GS that connect and tether it to ancient goddess cults. The Moderna aspect of this is in constant flux, as our social and political landscapes are continuously shifting. Indeed, what is modern and popular right now may not be in a few years' time. What we see as popular theories and practices in 20th century GS are kind of dropping off gradually in its modern manifestation. This leads on to the third theme, feminism. As I said earlier, not every adherent of GS identifies with feminism, but the majority do appear to. It was central to GS pre-millennium, when feminism was mainstream and novel. At the turn of the millennium, however, it lost momentum and even became unfashionable. Many people, including priestesses in non-GS pagan groups, denounced feminism, but with the caveat, but I still do believe in gender equality. So today, the fourth wave has made feminism popular again, and so many people find themselves feminist by default. As GS has a prominent feminist dimension, we can see it changing alongside it, with many goddess devotees advocating for trans and non-binary people, and challenging appropriation and white feminism within their communities. There is still a long way to go with this, and many groups are reluctant, but it is visibly happening. As well as affecting GS communities, it also affects how goddesses are interpreted. For example, pre-millennium warrior goddesses such as Athena were completely rejected by goddess feminists such as Carol P. Christ. In contrast, today the aggressive qualities of Kali, the Morrigan and Sekhmet are increasingly celebrated. For my thesis, I'm applying these three themes to the revival of three specific goddesses as case studies, doing a compare and contrast between their ancient cults and modern through the use of historical anchors. Ordinarily, my discipline would require a closer look at specific regional cults or time periods, but as GS selects from a broad corpus of material, I have to as well. The goddesses I'm focusing on are the Greek Aphrodite, the Egypto-Mediterranean asset Isis, and the Egyptian Sekhmet. To get a sense of historical anchors at work, let me give you an example from the revival of Sekhmet in GS. Throughout Egyptian ancient history, with significant consistency despite the passing of hundreds of years, Sekhmet was regarded as a fearsome goddess, responsible for spreading plague and pestilence across the land, and who would only withdraw her wrath if placated by repeated offerings. Her sensual mythology tells the story of how she came into existence as Hathor's incarnate rage, creating a bloodbath of humans who rebelled against the authority of the creator Ra. Her priests often doubled up as doctors, hoping that their offering rituals would encourage her sympathy in withdrawing afflictions from their patients. Kings praised her immense life-giving and life-taking powers on monumental temple walls, with Amenhotep III honouring her with hundreds of life-size statues, which you'll see across museums today. Common people exchanged amulets in her image, hoping for her fierce protection, as well as cast spells and wore amulets to ward away her fatal anger. Sekhmet's considerable popularity in GS therefore calls into question the common critique of scholars who have this impression that goddess devotees seek peace-loving, nurturing, passive mother goddesses. In GS, Sekhmet's rage is celebrated as the cathartic release of pent-up frustration and anger at oppressive systems of dominance, environmental destruction, and unjust marginalization. As noted by priestess Candace Kant, Sekhmet's name translates to the powerful female one. Owing to this, she has been reinterpreted as a feminist icon from the view of those who have participated in a culture with a long history of silencing marginalized genders and teaching women and girls to be passive, gentle, and ladylike. According to ancient mythology, Sekhmet is the antithesis of this, refusing to withhold her aggression and so powerful that even the male creator god was worried about her destructive potency. So when historically presented with passive and gentle religious but not divine mother figures in Judeo-Christianity, it is easy to understand why goddesses such as Sekhmet might be appealing to feminist devotees in the US and the UK. Today, our understanding of science and medicine is more informed than that of the ancient Egyptians, and so it is also understandable that blaming goddesses and daemons for the spread of disease would be less common. Indeed, even in many strands of modern Christianity, God appears less wrathful and punishing than he was known to be in antiquity or in other parts of the world today, though there are exceptions, of course. We think of the Westboro Baptist Church for one. The majority, though, of Anglo-American Christians tend to regard God and Jesus as more loving and forgiving, and less frequently blame natural disasters on divine intervention. The same is said for goddess spirituality, which I think reflects its 21st century Anglo-American context. So, though goddess devotees do acknowledge Sekhmet's association with disease and destruction, it is more popular to focus on her protective and healing powers. Whilst this is very different from ancient interpretations of Sekhmet, this deviation makes sense for the 21st century, although between you and me, it's not one that I personally adhere to. In antiquity, Sekhmet was a state goddess, rather than worshipped within the home, whose mythology explicitly states that syncretizing with the goddess Hathor, Sekhmet annihilated humans who rebelled against the authority of the patriarch, maintaining order. It is then curious how today she has become a symbol of the opposite, rebelling against monopolized authority and challenging the status quo. In the following slides, I want to highlight some of the major similarities and differences between Sekhmet's ancient and modern veneration, as demonstrated through the revival or innovation of relevant historical anchors. The first similarity is that Sekhmet is once again revived in a temple context. Pilgrims visit her statues in Karnak, though access to this temple would have been limited in antiquity. They also visit her modern temple in the Nevada desert, which is pictured right. The temple of goddess spirituality dedicated to Sekhmet is located in the Nevada desert, surrounded by sand and sunlight. And though this desert is in many ways different to that of Egypt, it is nevertheless a notable similarity, and I think quite deliberate. She's also revered in the home, not just in the form of protective amulets, but with domestic shrines and home altars, which is very common across a variety of different contemporary paganisms. As in ancient Egypt, Sekhmet's icons are believed to be imbued by her Ka, her divine spirit, her personality, and as such were and are greatly revered. There are countless reports from modern devotees who have had spiritual experiences with her statues in museums, sensing her energy within them, giving off heat, moving or in some way communicating messages and inspiring them to kneel. Sekhmet priestess Anne Key also coordinated a Sekhmet festival at the Nevada Temple for 3 years running, which involved performing rituals at dawn, midday, and dusk, and carrying Sekhmet's icon in ritual procession. While certainly attended by fewer people than ancient festivals and containing many modern elements, this is a clear attempt to refer to Sekhmet's ancient cults and examples of ritual processions carrying cult icons aloft, 3 times a day rituals. And so you can kind of see the similarity between these two pictures here, which I find absolutely beautiful. Other revivals can be seen in the use of ritual tools such as sistra, which were essential for appeasing Sekhmet in antiquity, as well as offering beer and wine. Some devotees also recreate ancient incense recipes like kaifi, which is a good example of experimental archaeology. Sekhmet continues to be associated with the colour red, shown through altar decorations and ritual clothing. GS does not deny Sekhmet's association with disease, though it does emphasise her healing abilities more often, even if healing comes through destruction. I have found it very interesting to examine how devotees are responding to the current pandemic in relation to Sekhmet. She appears to be either considered responsible for it or, more popularly, to be the cure. Though the latter view is more modern, this dichotomy remains the same as it was in the past. So each of these examples provide evidence for the consistent use of historical anchors to Sekhmet's ancient cults in GS, and calls into question the dismissal of scholars such as Mary Beard, who assert that contemporary paganism has nothing to do with ancient paganism, and thus nothing to do with her field. Historical elements are revived because they are found to be relevant, meaningful, and within the means of modern devotees. And deviations occur when aspects of ancient cults are inaccessible or conflict with modern values or needs. Though we cannot say what Sekhmet's cults would look like today if they had not had a 1,000-plus-year hiatus, we can reasonably assume that they would have travelled beyond Egypt, especially in the internet age. We can also posit that if they did reach Europe and the US, that Sekhmet's role in the spread of disease would be reinterpreted over time to accommodate developing medical knowledge, as we saw take place in the Renaissance with Christianity, for example. Whilst the pillars of religious practice may retain orthodoxy or change through splinter groups, common people would create localized and familial traditions, just as many religions in this part of the world have responded to or retaliated against changing political landscapes, such as opening up to gay marriage. So might Sekhmet's cults have adapted to feminist politics. And so, though it would be impossible and unscientific to make claims about how Sekhmet's cults would look in the 21st century if they had had the opportunity, it would be unfair to denounce GS as unreasonable in its interpretations. With this in mind, then, what is the problem? Why have there been and continue to be tensions between goddess devotees and secular scholars? I will be investigating this in my final thesis chapter, which I'm not yet working on. However, doing background research on GS so far, I think I have a bit of an idea. One reason for the negative relationship between pagans and scholars is owing to contemporary paganism's counter. Speaking specifically about goddess spirituality with its origins in second-wave feminism, GS sought to smash the patriarchy by elevating female divinity, women in religious positions such as priestesses, and to celebrate women's roles in society, culture, and history, which have historically been downplayed or erased by androcentric religion and social structures. Until comparatively recently, universities and academia were elitist institutions, which women, people of colour, lower class citizens were prohibited from attending. Even now, universities are being criticised for the lack of diversity and representation in their faculty and studentships, especially in the case of classics and Egyptology, with which I am a part. The pushback on the part of scholars against feminists in becoming interested in pre- and ancient history between the 70s and 90s was quite intense and dismissive, in many cases reasonably so, but not always. This exacerbated feminist suspicions that the elite were trying to block knowledge of a perceived truth of matriarchal prehistory, for example. Wading through the material from this time is tough because there's equal amount of valid critiques and discoveries alongside conspiracy and poor methodology on both sides. Caroline Tully, who like me is on both sides of the secular spiritual camps, has addressed the cognitive dissonance displayed by some pagans in relation to their non-acceptance of archaeological and scholarly assessments of historical data. Indeed, some goddess devotees insist that the only reason scholars dismiss the great goddess hypothesis is because they are upholding the patriarchy. The truth is there is insubstantial evidence for this theory, and scholars may understandably get frustrated when their life's work is so readily dismissed by the public. Aside from entering into the realm of misinformation and alternative archaeology, there are also socio-political concerns raised through referencing the ancient world for contemporary political and religious purposes. And this is something that, as an insider, I really feel like pagans ought to be more conscious of, and I think we are getting there. So there is a long history of manipulating narratives for political use, from antiquity to the modern day, so this is nothing new. Think about the way the Third Reich made use of ancient Mediterranean and Germanic history, or even more recently how white supremacists today use warped interpretations of ancient Greek, Roman, and Norse cultures to justify their ideologies. So there's good cause to be a little wary. There is this narrative in GS that adheres to the concept of patriarchal takeover and oppressing goddess-revering societies, or matriarchal societies, whether it be during the Neolithic, or the spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire, or during the Euro-American witch trials. This isn't just in GS, and it appears across contemporary paganisms. Such narratives often present women as a homogenous group of oppressed people, equating the witch hunts to a woman holocaust, I've read. Not only does this dismiss the intersectional differences of women's experiences, but it also enables a white, educated majority demographic to identify as the oppressed and to abdicate any association with oppressive histories. When I recently read the widely circulated When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone, I saw that the patriarchal takeover theory was applied here through using the dynastic race theory. So this is essentially an outdated idea that suggests the indigenous people of North Africa could not have created ancient Egyptian civilization, and so a supposedly superior race took over and founded the dynasties of pharaohs. Though Stone views these invaders as the patriarchs who oppressed the native matriarchal people, it still ultimately supports this theory, which is rooted in racism and colonial discourse. And this is a book which is still widely popular amongst goddess devotees. Still, when much up-to-date, reliable, well-researched scholarly material is filled with inaccessible jargon and often barricaded behind a paywall or a student-only university library, less reliable, more accessible pagan sources are understandably preferred. That said, there are also some excellent pagan authors putting out good information out there, such as Sarita Dieste, Isadora Forrest, and Leslie Jackson. In my first thesis questionnaire, an impressive 93% of respondents asserted that it was quite or very important for their sources to be accurate, and that authors specify when they are sharing UPG, or unverified personal notice. Most pagans want the well-researched, accurate stuff. As I said at the start of this presentation, during Paul Harrison's study of Cometicism, he interviewed several individuals who were professional or studying Egyptologists who kept their beliefs private so as not to jeopardize their careers. Elsewhere, priestess of Sekhmet, Dr. Anne Key, shares a conversation she had at an academic conference with an anthropologist colleague who advised her not to be open about her beliefs, owing to a strong anti-religious bias in academia. So I'm all too aware of the precarious position I am in as a polytheist engaged with Egyptology and currently researching goddess spirituality, having taken part in goddess spirituality communities in the past. Though this isn't really much different from imams and priests undertaking theology degrees, it does appear that monotheism or atheism are reviewed as much more professional for a white British scholar than polytheistic beliefs relating to so-called dead religions. For this reason, and considering the role that ancient history and archaeology play in contemporary paganism, I suspect there are more pagan scholars of the ancient world than is currently known. The field of pagan studies is a relatively new one, and one which comprises many insider researchers. There are many advantages to this. For example, research participants can be more trusting of you and present opportunities that they may otherwise be reticent or slow to offer to outsiders. There are, however, some traps that might be easy to fall into. Davidson has put forward 4 common mistakes made by insider researchers of pagan studies, such as they can be essentialist, making generalized statements about the pagan community. They can be exclusivist, where they only select data that fulfills a certain ideal. They can be loyalist, and they might not want to criticize the communities that they're involved in, or supernaturalist, where they might lapse into referring to ancient deities, taking their reality for granted, rather than writing with objective academic atheism. Goddess devotees and pagans are an ever-expanding special interest group for museums, heritage sites, and historical scholarship. At a time when governments are withdrawing funding for the arts and humanities, enthusiastic public support is well needed. Scholars such as Jenny Blaine, Robert Wallace, and Catherine Roundtree have demonstrated the many ways that pagans and goddess devotees support the heritage sector, from volunteering their time to maintain heritage sites, to making financial donations, attending special exhibitions, and purchasing literature from scholars and museum souvenirs. That is not to say, however, that all pagan interaction is always helpful. Sometimes interference is uninformed, politically partisan, and physically invasive, with pilgrims trespassing, touching objects and artifacts and ruins, or leaving behind offerings, which are all acts that can damage physical remains, as tempting as they may be. Trust me, I know. That said, much of this is a matter of outreach and education. It remains clear that ultimately pagans, goddess devotees, scholars, and heritage professionals alike all seek to learn about, preserve, and protect heritage and the pagan past. I agree with Laurel Zwisler that condescension on the part of scholars seeking to exercise their intellectual authority over the ignorant masses is not the way forward. Speakers for an academic conference on alternative Egyptology this April came to the conclusion that the best way to address common misconceptions and pseudo-archaeologies is to engage with them, to build relationships, and to put our information out there in an accessible way that speaks to people rather than speaks down to them. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there were several people in that conference who were situated on both sides of the conversation too. Nurturing a healthy reciprocal dialogue stands to benefit both sides, which in actual fact are not oppositional sides at all. So what can we actually do? I still have some time in my research to identify methods from the perspective of all groups concerned. Already early on, though, I can identify some suggestions. Firstly, we need to acknowledge that secular scholars and pagans are coming from different methodological and epistemological standpoints. They're coming from two different points of view and they're not necessarily talking about the same thing. Scholars can extend artifact and site biographies to include contemporary history, which I'm very keen on. An exhibition at the Manchester Museum collaborated with Honouring the Ancient Dead, which featured a place where pagans could deposit offerings for displayed human remains. This maximises engagement as well as demonstrates history in the making. Museums and sites could also arrange for quiet hours or hire out spaces for ceremonies and specialised tours. This would bring in funds as well as new visitors. We need to do better in making research and heritage sites more accessible, which is a wide conversation. It's not a new one, and we're still working on it. And simply just take pagans more seriously. There seems to be this idea that pagans are eccentric and live in a fantasy world, but my experience is that many are very studious and deeply philosophize about polytheism, ethics, and psychology. My heart has been warmed when I've seen instances of priestesses and druids having been invited to speak as guest lecturers at universities, sharing their contemporary experience of reviving aspects of the ancient world. I think this kind of communication helps us to understand each other better and deepens our understanding of the subject overall. For example, the woman pictured on this slide, Maya Vassallo, a priestess of Aphrodite, was invited to speak at the University of Rome in 2019, though this image is not of that event. As I go deeper into my research, I hope to extract many more practical considerations that we could actually put into action. With all of that, I thank you for listening to me today, and I invite you to engage with my work, whether it be spiritual, professional, or both. On this slide are links to my link trees because I have to keep these things separate. The first are links to my spiritually related material, particularly my books and blog. Here you will also find links to the charities that I donate my book royalties to, which are focused on supporting Egyptian and Nubian communities today. The second links you to my PhD research and scholarly publications. I have 2 in the pipeline at the moment. I invite you to get involved with my research if you want to, especially if you happen to identify with goddess spirituality and venerate Mediterranean or Egyptian goddesses in your practice. So thank you all for listening. I will be around for a short while to answer any questions that you might have.